You and I have had so many experiences since our childhood. And if I were to ask a question, can you bring to memory all the experiences? Is it even possible? Assuming you don't have constraints of time and the priorities that you have committed to or you're already embedded into. Chances are that your answer may be no. You cannot bring to memory, recollect all experiences, even if you wanted to. If we ask the question, why is it the case? Then we may get different answers depending on whether you're looking at neuroscientific explanation or attention based explanation or motive related explanations, so on and so forth. And now, if I ask you a question, have you integrated all those experiences in yourself? You might begin to wonder, uh, what does it really mean to integrate all those experiences? I think the closest that could come to explaining to integrate the past experiences that one has had is what's the narrative. You could come up with various narratives of your life. So one could look at a slice of your childhood. One could look at a slice of vacation. One can look at a slice of learning. One could look at a slice of the most awkward experience. So you could have different slices or filters, and you could bring up those experiences and stitch together a narrative around it. That narrative would have elements of some emotions, elements of certain things that happened to you, and you did something, so on and so forth. And even as you're listening to this, you're trying to integrate what you're hearing with a lot of things inside of you, with your experience, motives, current mindset, current body state, current emotional state, current context, social setting that you are in. So, the time you have to listen to this, the thing that you want to do immediately after this, what you were doing immediately before listening to this, so on and so forth. There are a huge number of factors that would go into integrating this particular thing. The question is, at some point of time, one realizes that there are some things which are constantly confusing people. There are open questions you don't have answers to, or even if you have answers to, you now want to question, why is it that despite having the answers, things are not playing out the way they ought to, depending on the answer, or people are not behaving the way they ought to, given some kind of rationality that you're aware of and they are aware of. I think we quickly reach a place. In fact, we frequently reach a place where there are a lot of things that we do not know, that we can't explain, or some people have not been able to explain, or even if there were explanations and knowing in the past, they're not mapping onto what ought to be done, and you ought to see that happening around you, through you, in others, in society, in culture, so on and so forth. There are a lot of things that remain in the terrain of the inexplicable, that which cannot be explained, that is not being accessed, that is not being put together, and things are hanging in various silo or overlapping explanations. And then it becomes difficult for a person to make sense of that, because this there remains something lingering, which is incomplete, which is inadequate, which is not graspable in some sense. And then one needs to rely on something, that which will give people the sort of comfort, confidence, that at some level, at some span, at some scale, at some dimension, all of these things do connect, all of these things do relate, all of these things actually hang in together. Sometimes it takes form of religion, the belief that beyond a certain point, that we have an access to through our senses and sense making, there are things which we don't understand, but then let's believe that there is some power up above us, beyond us, that is taking care of this. And in this sense, the something which is understandable, experienceable, explainable, integrates with the not understandable, the inaccessible, and the inexperienceable, and the inexplicable. In some sense, there is this dance that is happening between the two: the understandable, accessible, experienceable, explicable, and the opposite of it. There is a constant dance happening. And the part that is not understandable, not accessible, not experienceable, not explicable, we tend to rely on something else. As I said, it could be religion, it could be somebody else. It could be reliance on somebody who's coming across as a charismatic person, confident person, or somebody who appears as intelligent, more wise, and you rely on their narrative or a narrative of the past. The challenge in today's time is so much as we have vastly more number of products on the planet today, consumer uh, consumption oriented. We have vastly more number of jobs on the planet today in terms of the kinds of the jobs today. We have vastly more number of democratic voters in on the planet today. um, we have vastly more number of PhDs and books and retreats and all these sorts of experiences available today. And yet we find ourselves bombarded by so many confusing questions every day. Or let me reframe: we keep coming across in our social media feed, in our mainstream media feed, in our conversation with our in group and out group, this constant tussle, which is sort of so much of challenge, so many challenges coming up on the surface today. There is this urge, in fact, this urge turning into urgency, emergency, to be able to understand it, make sense of it, access it in some way. And hence, I think we become very tentative in terms of relying on something that can come across as a narrative that could fill in this particular part that is not experienceable, that is not explainable, that is not understandable, that is not explainable, any of these four, or an overlap of this. So this could be at the level of the individual, at the level of group. uh, Constantly there is this tussle going on for some form of scarcity that has been created by man or by nature, and those scarcities are being traded in some way. There's a give and take, a tightly coupled reciprocity: give this, take this, give this, take this, and or leading to some sort of games, the bending of rules of which, or the blinding of rules of which, would give a certain group and a set of individuals access to, power to these scarce resources. It could be designation, it could be any form of thing that could help them perpetuate better, perpetuate their own self, or their or whoever they want to perpetuate better. Then there are some very other interesting nuance to this. Recently, I was visiting my village, and I was interacting with some of the people, and I realized that people have certain norms that they hold each other accountable to. And there are instances where some individuals have been tightly holding on to those norms, but instrumentalizing those norms, in implementing those norms when interacting with the other, has resulted in some form of awkwardness or harm or long term relationship accidents. And yet people are holding on to norms. So the holding of certain belief tightly. So imagine x-axis holding on to certain norms or beliefs or values very tightly on the right hand side, highly tightly, or loosely on the left hand side. And then it results in long term harm or help for this particular individual who's holding these norms. We could see that sometimes tightly holding norms could help, sometimes tightly holding norms could harm, sometimes loosely holding norms could help, norms could loosely holding norms could harm. Another interesting thing that could come here is it could be the case that sometimes people hold on to certain convictions, hold on to certain belief, hold on to certain norms, certain values, and despite having repercussions in terms of the relationships with the others, uh, they believe in the conviction because they believe that there is something which is a bigger, larger, beyonder kind of a good, greater good, in the service of which this norm need to be held. And then it could be adaptive for the civilization because there are cases where people have stood by their convictions for their entire life, and only later in their life or after their death, people have realized that their convictions were really well founded. They were well thought, well reflected. So these are the things which become very tricky, because when you're trying to integrate your thinking, feeling, saying, doing, ethics, and interacting with the political, economic, social structures outside, there are so many of these nuances that need to be brought into awareness and meditated upon on a frequent basis in order to churn this ocean that would throw up some good and some bad. We'll try to cover some of further nuances in the next episodes.